is rather hilarious.
Here's the thing though, Monty. One, obviously we can discuss anything we want to. So one thing I think we should do is here's my joke approach, right? Which is obviously there are certain people we can't have on our show, Monty. Maybe their connection with Riot is too close. Maybe they just don't fuck with me and you on a personal level, or we just don't have any built connection. But we can, as Dom and LS have all taught me, we can just react to their content, therefore profiting with our own content, and they essentially start the convo for us. It's like they're on the show, but they just don't get to talk. So basically, like old someone in Insight for the first 20 minutes. That's a fucking straight fire reference if you know the deep lore, but you don't, so shut the fuck up. So, by the way, that might be the most egregious thing of all time, is that it's not even like we were talking about small guests, by the way, guys. It's not like when I would have like Kelsey Moser. I would have like Soaz sit for 10 minutes while I do about 15 jokes, roasting him, all his team, and then he gets to talk eventually. So what I thought we'd do is there was actually some interesting community / other concept related discussions I would like to have with you. I thought some of them were quite fun. Like I saw on the dive, I thought this was a pretty good topic. Fair play to for coming up with it. They did the debate because it's obviously the main MVP debate in LCS. Who was better, Berserker or Prince? It's a pretty good convo to have, right, Monty? Right? They're both in prime position with the teams in terms of who they are in their teams. They're the star players. They're both incredibly good ADCs. They're both even bloody Korean ADCs. Like it's everything's checking out. So obviously I think this is quite a good topic because on the one hand, early in the split, it would have been hands down Prince for most people because he looked like starred, amazing import, winning every game. Now, obviously, though, they've had the roster changes in Cloud9. They've retooled their squad a little bit. And Berserker has the inertia of last year. Everyone knows how incredible he was in Cloud9 last year. So I actually wanted to get your take on this. Where do you sit on this particular debate, buddy? Is it a debate for you?
I think, I mean, it is. And I think it's really quite difficult to choose between them because they've both been incredible, as you say. They've actually had very similar statistics overall too. There's virtually no discernible difference statistically between them. When you think about, I mean, Berserker or Prince rather is a slightly higher economy AD carry, but part of that is because Impact is like the lowest economy top laner, as we know, within the LCS. He takes like the smallest percentage of gold share of any top laner in the league, and so I guess Haunter has taken slightly less, but obviously that's, you know, Impact takes the lowest CS percentage after 15 minutes. So I think when we think about Prince and Berserker, a lot of it comes down to, you could argue, the head-to-head performance, which Berserker, at least in recent memory, in the last week when we saw this competition. But is that really the right metric to take, considering that Berserker, especially in the Draven game, got super fed off of like a tower dive that wasn't, it wasn't like a 1v1 versus Prince. There were other factors that were getting Berserker fed in the head, and certainly Prince still had a pretty good game on the Aphelios, and they almost came back. Cloud9, I would say, I think Blabber is probably the best jungler overall in the LCS, so he could also
be an MVP candidate himself, right?
Yep. Yeah, I also think that it's unquestionable that Sven is at least top 3, if not top 2 supports in the league, because support position is kind of weak right now. Core JJ hasn't performed, so it's like Sven and Vulcan, I would say, are the 1 and 2, in what order they're in, you can debate. So as good as, Winsome was doing with Prince at the start of the season, they switched to Ayla, and Ayla has not looked as good since he arrived and got his visa. So I would say that Berserker has more help among the positions that typically get you ahead in the jungle and the support positions. So you take that into consideration as well. But like I said, Prince gets a bigger share of the resources in order to carry for the team, which was always Prince's way on Live Sandbox last year. If you guys remember, famously, he had like the highest percentage of gold in the entire league of any player, because that was the way they won games. It was like him and Aiming were way up at the top in those categories last year. So I think Berserker is playing with a more complete roster, and Prince has had a harder time because his team, especially in the last few weeks, has had a bad habit of getting pretty far behind in the early game and then having to make comebacks, and a lot of these comebacks are powered by Prince's excellent play in team fights, right? So I think Cloud9 is the better team at the moment between them and FlyQuest. But I would say that if I had to give it to one player, because again, I think that this is a really subjective call because they both had such incredibly good performances, I would probably give it to Prince, even though he's looked weaker recently based on the entire split body of work. And also just the fact that for FlyQuest to win, it feels like Prince has to carry harder. And the team's designed around him carrying, basically. It's not that they have, a player like Fudge in the top side who's going to take more of those resources and play more carry oriented champions that are going to, take the burden off a little bit. Because as it stands right now, Fudge is up at the very top of like damage for top laners because of the kind of champions that he tends to carry.
I actually, I'm on a similar position. I would pick Prince, but I would say at the outset, I do think actually this is a totally legit debate. I think it is a 1A, 1B scenario. Yeah. You can pick which preference you have. But here's my reasoning why. One, I agree totally stylistically. The difference is there are very dangerous players. I mean, as we just discussed there, like you can argue that Berserker has a fellow MVP candidate on his team. There's no one on FlyQuest who's getting the MVP aside from Prince. Like that's not even debatable. There's not even a debate within FlyQuest. And so there's one factor. He clearly has more help in that sense. And as you say, that's pretty influential help to have in a region that plays through fucking bot lane forever, by the way. So jungler's pretty good position to have the help from. Meanwhile, who has Speaker in any MVP debate? No one. Absolutely no one in the entire world. Even FlyQuest wouldn't put him in that. So then also I'd say this. If you look stylistically how the two teams play, if people don't know, I mean, you see it in this FlyQuest, but Monte's right. If you go and look at Live Sandbox, they really were like the first Korean team I've ever seen that did the Uzi Eye, raise the puppy strap. Yes. Like everything was just get this guy ahead, funnel everything into him. And if we get to the right point in the game where the ADC has the items and has the fights, he wins the fight. So essentially, I'm with you. The difference is, Prince has to almost win every game for FlyQuest. Berserker could, but it's somewhat optional. It depends what they want to do in draft. Depends what the opponent's like.
Too. Yeah, exactly. Blabber can carry the game too. I mean, it's not that Vikla can't carry, but Vikla's laning phase for the last few weeks has been so tragic that it makes it so that they're pretty much consistently playing from behind, and the burden is often on Prince's shoulders.
Even when you talk about other talent, like even though he obviously didn't start the split in the team, Ebenez, people want him like all pro first team, etc. Like, because he's been popping off like a motherfucker. Like, I'm with you. Vikla started quite promising. He's had a bit of some sus weeks, quite frankly. He was one of the first things to start breaking down on this team for me. So I think actually, when you look at the team overall, I have to go with Prince. I think he's the only reason FlyQuest is where they are. Like, I think the guy's just a stud. And I'd also say this: I can make arguments for Berserker, but I would put it this way. This is how I would frame it to someone debating me. I would just say, well, what has Prince done wrong? You know what I mean? What's he done wrong?
Some kind of cocky laning phases, but again, this is recently it's been with Ayla in the laning phase, who has been, I think, worse.
He also changed supports. There's another one, Monte. Yes. The other guy kept the same support from last year that he's literally worked with like one-on-one for ages now. This guy just swapped supports mid-split and was like, guess I'll just keep holding.
There's also the fact that Sven is a former AD carry player who has been plopped right in the middle of an AD carry as support meta. Which I will say he has not looked as good on as you might expect from that sentence. You would expect him to completely shit on everybody in this meta, and that like hasn't been the case. In fact, some games he's kind of looked questionable on certain AD carry supports, which has been surprising. But yeah, I think for me, Prince is he just barely makes the cut if you think about all of the factors, how hard he has to carry, and the angles that FlyQuest has to win feel like they don't really exist without Prince. I think another interesting thought exercise is what happens if you swap these two players onto each other's teams. And I'm not sure it actually changes much, if I'm going to be honest. It just feels like whoever's on FlyQuest has a harder time performing, so that the end result of having more won games is more challenging.
Like, I'd also throw this in as well. One other thing to say is this, because I hate when people do this in MVP votes. MVP is the regular split, and it's the entire regular split. So when people do the recency bias, well, they had a few bad games. Doesn't matter. Okay, I'll counter that. Are you ready for my counter? Do you see the first games of Prince? What are you talking about? It's fucking Smurf for the whole league. So, like, that's the even out, guys. Like, you can't just say at the end he did better. Because that's the one thing they're doing, which doesn't apply. I don't know if you know this. You probably do. Right? Even if you don't follow the NBA, because unfortunately every NBA team plays 82 fucking regular season games, no press can cover every game. So what they tend to do, sadly, is they just go on teams that have the high records. That's the first filter. And then the filter becomes, as whack as this sounds, they will do stuff, Monty, like when the two top teams with the big candidates play each other in a big televised game, whoever wins that game and outperforms the other star tends to win MVP. They do factors like that because essentially they're trying to find like shorthand for who is probably better. We don't need to do that in LCS. You don't play that many games, guys. We don't have to go. But what about when Cloud9 played FlyQuest in the last game of the split? Irrelevant. Here's my question. How did Prince and Berserker play in every game of the split against every opponent? Because there's another one. It's not the case, by the way, for MVP. This is very key. It's different if you want to say who was the better player in your opinion. If I'm going a better player, I would mainly just look at against elite teams because I want to see how do you do it against the best. For MVP, it's against everyone. So even if you're like, yeah, but you just smurfed on a shit, that doesn't matter. They're all the teams in the LCS. I always say this, and I'll do a video on it soon because I think I've nailed the angle. My problem is this, right? I've always hated the idea MVP even has to be on the best team. So I've got the new way I'm going to phrase it, Monty, but I'm going to do a whole video on it. It's not called MVP of FlyQuest. It's called MVP of the LCS. So logically, it's any player on any team. It's just the best. It's the most valuable player in the whole LCS, not on his team. That no one ever said that, actually. So I actually think, yeah, if you look at it, I think it's a very good, interesting discussion. I just thought it'd be a cool one to bring up.
Yeah, no, I think it is good just because this race has been so close, and in a lot of other leagues, like it just doesn't feel close. Like LCK, it's pretty clearly Keria, and I don't know how you escape
especially because of the meta angle
that
as well.
conclusion. Yes. I really don't know how you come up with any other name that is even in the conversation, given the meta shifts, how important he's been to T1, the dominance through the bot lane that we've seen. Yeah, I think there was pretty clearly it for me. Like I said, last split in LEC for the Winter Split. Did they even do an MVP of Winter Split? I have no idea, actually. It was Mickey X.
Did he actually win it though?
I don't know. I don't know if they
I know they did the voting, but I don't know if they ever like made a big deal out of it or not.
Yeah, I didn't see any promotion about that, but you know, it only really matters who I think is MVP, Thorin. That's the conclusion that I've come to, especially with some of these MVP votes being super crazy. And this LCS one does feel quite challenging. As for LPL right now, I think there's, for me, it's probably been Scout.
See more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, you know, be a pleb and don't.